Hi, everybody. My name is Jaime Luu with the Brewing Bright Minds podcast. I'm here with Miss Dom, and we have a very special guest, Miss Natalie Waldman.
Thank you for having me.
Miss Natalie Waldman has been with us at our school, helping us support some of our students with speech services. And we just thought it would be amazing to have her join and bring her insight into the really loaded topic of speech-language pathology. Natalie, could you give us a little background on your experience?
So yes, my background includes I've worked the full spectrum. I've worked with young children basically from 2, and I've worked with adults in skilled nursing facilities. So my background includes working in the public schools as well as in skilled nursing before starting my own private practice, so I could specialize in the area that just really lights me up, which is preschool speech and language development. I work with late talkers and children who are hard to understand. That's my jam.
Perfect. Wonderful. And that's how we miraculously found you. So that's great. That's great. Our first question is, what has led you to pursue a career in speech therapy?
So my career is a little bit winding. I completed an undergraduate degree in a related field, and I moved abroad to the Netherlands for many years. Oh. And while living in Amsterdam, I was an international executive recruiter. Wow. And when I moved back to the States, it was very different. Recruitment was not what I had in mind for the long term. And I kept thinking, like, what are the things that light me up? What are things I'm excited about? And although it seems like a strange and unrelated path, I'm working with people who are internationals. We have languages. We have finding out what's important to people. We have making connections. We have helping profession. So I was looking for something like that. And on my journey, I would ask everybody I met, like, what do you do and how do you like it? And one day I happened to be in my niece's gym class, and I was in the lobby sitting with a mom, and I said, so, do you work outside the home? And she said, yes. And she told me about speech-language pathology. And when I heard it's about how the brain works. It's about languages. It's about helping people. It's about, you can make it what you want. You can work with young children. You can work with adults. You can work with a gamut. I felt like I found my calling, and I went back to school after having had a whole prior career, and I re-careered, and it's the best thing I've ever done. What I love about it is that there's a very clear process. Like there's a difficulty that a child or their families are experiencing, and we have clear ways to help and support families, and that is really meaningful work.
So the field of speech-language pathology, it's so comprehensive, and there's so many things involved. How would you break it down to its fundamental principles to maybe somebody who doesn't know what the field is, or maybe people who are interested in the field or majoring in it in college, things like that?
Yeah. So speech-language pathology is really broad. And so when we go to school for many years. You needed an undergrad degree in communicative disorders, and then you go on to get your speech-language pathology master's. You could get a master's of science or a master's of arts, depending on your school's program. So a speech-language pathologist actually works with anything that's kind of above the waist. Oh, wow. So it includes the brain. So for example, if someone has a stroke and they need to rehabilitate because they don't have access to their language, or they have difficulty swallowing, we help with that. It also extends to language, so children who are perhaps stuttering, we call that fluency. That's a whole specialization in and of itself. It includes language. So what we do is we kind of parse out speech and language are kind of used interchangeably. Sometimes people will say it's a speech delay, but we separate speech and language out. So speech is how we pronounce sounds to make words. So like the word mom has the ah, and the sound. So that's what we call speech. It's the sounds that make up words. We also work on language, which is 2 parts. Language is how we understand what people are saying. So oftentimes when our children are not appearing not to follow directions, it can be because they're not understanding what is that we're saying. or maybe they have a hearing difficulty and we're having to tease that out. So I think it's maybe a two-part question. So one is, if someone's thinking about going to school, what does speech-language pathology look like? So that looks like taking care of people from all ends of the spectrum, from infancy to elderly age. It can include things like feeding and swallowing in their early years. That's a specialization for those who are interested in that. It can be, as we spoke about, the speech, so pronunciation, which is my jam, and language, right? So language we break down into two parts. One is the understanding. So kind of like if you've ever traveled to a foreign country, usually you can understand a little bit more than you can usually say. The same tends to be true of children. So when we talk about language, we talk about receptive language. That's understanding language. So for example, following directions, being able to answer when someone says, "How old are you?" and a child can say that they're 2 or they're 3. That's their ability to demonstrate their understanding. And then we also have expressive language, which is how we put words together to formulate language. Expressive language also includes any way that we communicate. So it can also include sign language, or for some individuals who are non-speaking, they may use an alternative communication device, such as an iPad, to communicate for them, where they push the buttons and it helps them communicate. So that's in a nutshell kind of what someone looking to go back to school or looking at speech-language pathology, those are the areas that they might consider or have an interest in. And as far as parents are concerned, I think that most parents are looking, the primary things that I hear most from parents that come to me is, my child's not talking yet. What should I do? I can't understand my child when they speak. What should I do? And so usually those types of things fall under the speech, so that pronunciation and the language piece.
And so it's important for parents to kind of think about and evaluate, and teachers in the classroom to see, at home, is my child having an issue understanding me and hearing me and understanding what I am saying? And so they're not kind of making sense of what I'm saying and able to follow directions or to, carry out the tasks that they want to do, versus they have it all there. You can see that their understanding is there. However, their ability to articulate it has not been developed quite yet. And so they'll nod, they'll gesture, they'll do other things, which is all part of language and speech because they're communicating. However, their ability to verbally articulate what they want to communicate is not quite there. So for parents and teachers to understand, when you're observing your child, what are you noticing? And that's very valuable for you to know in terms of their treatment and their program.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between communicative disorders as well as a speech and a language disorder?
So when we talk about communication disorders, we're usually, and there could be lots of them, right? Because we talked about the whole gamut that a speech-language pathologist addresses. But for the purposes, I think, of today, is we're probably talking more about the preschool years, what you might be observing in your school, or what parents might be observing at home. So kind of the most common things we're looking at are speech and language. So language first is that understanding piece. When I think about describing that, sometimes I think about kind of when you grow a flower, below the soil, the roots are established and you can't see them. What you do see is the sprout that blossoms above the soil surface. So when we think about language, receptive language or understanding piece is the stuff that happens below the soil. You can't really see it, but it needs to be there in order to create a sprout for the expressive language. That's the vocabulary words, which most parents are really, and educators are real keyed into. When it comes to understanding language or receptive language, the thing that we need to be aware of is that we need to tease out, like we're talking about toddlers who are developing their sense of self. They may understand what we're saying and they may choose not to cooperate. So our job is to tease out, is it that this child doesn't choose to cooperate or are they unable to cooperate? And sometimes it can be a little confusing and people tend to think like, oh, this child is misbehaving, when really we come to find out maybe they're not hearing properly, or maybe they're not understanding. So the first rule of thumb, anytime we have any concern about a child's ability to understand, is we suggest a hearing test. So let's find out for sure that this child's hearing. And people say, but my kid can hear a pin drop in the other room. And I'll say, that may be true, but they might not be hearing all frequencies. And sometimes young children will have ear infections, and it can make it sound as though everybody else is underwater. So I recently had a client that I evaluated, and this child wasn't really responding to their name or really engaging much back and forth. And the parents had mentioned sleep disturbances, and they mentioned that the child wasn't eating very well and that the child had frequent ear infections. So the first recommendation is, let's just get a hearing check. And the parent said, but I just had one maybe like 6 or 9 months ago. I said, you know what? Just do me a favor. Let's just do it again, because what happens is ear infections can cause fluctuations in hearing, and they're not always noticeable. Like sometimes we know, right? Our children are in pain and it's very obvious, but sometimes it's not. And for those children, they can miss out on hearing for long periods of time.
Interesting.
So this child, the hearing was checked. Turned out the child was not hearing well. In addition, the sleep disturbances, I like to look at children really holistically. So I said, let's have an ENT look at this. If the child's not eating and they're snoring is not typical. Let's have them checked out. And it turned out this poor child's airway was obstructed. So they weren't hearing well and they weren't breathing well. So then they weren't sleeping well. So when we look at our children, when they're not understanding, maybe there's more to the picture. So first thing you want to do, want to check their hearing to rule that out. If they're not sleeping well, or we're noticing that they're snoring, or and that's a consistent thing. You know, if you're not sleeping well, you're going to have trouble kind of keeping it together.
Right.
And so it may look like you're not understanding when really you're just not feeling your best.
And could that be like waking up in the middle of the night as well? Or even like, you know, every child fights bedtime. They never want to go to sleep. But things like fighting bedtime and waking up in the middle of the night and snoring, like you said, are all of those kind of what you mean by sleep disturbances?
Yeah. So sleep disordered breathing is something that we look for. So when a child is snoring, that's not typical. Now, of course, everybody has an occasional cold, and then they're going to be snoring, or maybe they're really, knocked out. But as healthy breathing means that children are breathing through their nose with their lips closed, and that should be through the day and at night. So if you hear your child snoring and it's a regular thing, or they're really, they move around a lot in their beds, like they're very active sleepers, frequent wakings, their mouth is open during the day. We look at those things there's just pieces to the puzzle that we keep in mind, because again, if you're not sleeping well, you're going to have trouble probably keeping it together during the day and following directions and communicating. So it can be a part of the puzzle, and many times we're looking at the child holistically. We notice, we need to go to the ENT. And, the child that I was speaking about, their adenoids and tonsils were so enlarged that they had a very narrow airway. They weren't breathing.
Wow.
So when you put it all together, like, you're not breathing because you're waking up all night, you're fighting bedtime, which toddlers fight bedtime. It's not necessarily, means something clinical, but if they're waking up frequently and they're not sleeping well and they're not eating well and they're not responding pretty regularly, we need to look in a little more deeply. So for the purpose of parents, have your child's hearing checked if you have a concern. And when it comes to understanding, what I tell parents is sometimes we don't know if a child's choosing not to follow direction or they don't understand. And so I have strategies that I recommend irrespective. So there's, for example, a great strategy called Tell, Show, Help. This is by Laura Mize, is kind of one of the gurus of early intervention for speech-language pathology. And that's about kind of giving the minimum amount of support for a child and then adding support as needed. So for example, you tell your child, it's time to go to school, go get your shoes. And they don't. Now, maybe they're choosing not to, or maybe they're not understanding. So the next thing, besides telling them, the next step up is you show. So tell, then you show. So I might point to the shoes and say, put your shoes on. I've given them two ways to take in that information, visually as well as verbally. Let's say that still doesn't help. Then we get to the help. So I think of it, I have a step ladder. I think I have a visual on my Instagram or on my blog. It's basically tell, show, help. Help means, okay, my child hasn't gotten their shoes. I'm going to gently take their hand and say, let's go get your shoes. And we're walk over together and pick up the shoes together. It's never punitive. It's never, it's just whatever we did first wasn't enough help. We're going to add a little layer of support, and that works. Maybe it is a behavior and they don't feel like putting their shoes on.
Right.
That's okay. We can help them get there. But if they're not understanding, these strategies are also really helpful for supporting that communication.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's really important because I think for educators, for teachers, for anyone who works with such young children, for the ones, who if you're like running late for something and you are just trying to get out the door, I think that's where the frustration comes and you start to get frustrated. And maybe you just put their shoes on for them and go out the door really quick. And then at that point, it's kind of, they're not learning to put their shoes on. They're just learning that they're kind of in a rush.
Yeah.
So I think that's important for everyone to just kind of stop and remember that taking a little bit more time to show them, help them, tell them, like you just said, it's just bettering them.
Yeah.
It's bettering the child.
And tell, show, help is a great strategy, but maybe you don't have time. Like realistically, like some days you just got to get out the door. Yeah. And so no shame in that game. It's just a strategy that parents or educators can keep in their pocket for when that works for them.
Right.
Because sometimes you do just have to get to school. But you're right, giving time and that's a hard thing, especially today because we're
very,
so
very
busy. Yeah.
Yeah, and that what you mentioned, it not being in a punitive manner, that's what's the hard part.
Yes.
How can we?
Hard. Yes.
But if we keep rushing out the door every single time, then we're not allowing those self-help skills and giving them the time. Maybe they just need time. We have so many students where they want to do the task. However, they just need the time to go at their pace. And so as parents, we just need to give them that grace and that time so that they can do it in their own way. But I love that formula because then it kind of gives parents that mantra of, first I'm going to tell. It allows us that rest that we need to give our children that time as well. So that's huge.
That's great.